we are gathered here today to discuss Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. I feel so blessed to be able to talk about this, even though I don't think this video is going to do that well because it's a book that's been out for a little bit. But if you like Sally Rooney or this book or any of the thoughts that I have to share, I know it's like really early for me to ask for a like. The video hasn't even started, but like at any point, please let me know if you'd like to interact with this video because it really helps out my videos, my channel, everything. Anyway, this book has been kind of highly anticipated. If you are a Sally Rooney girl, you're pretty much going to cling on to everything she comes out with because her style of writing. Sally Rooney to me is the type of author that says the quiet part out loud. And that's why a lot of people have labeled her as relatable and why a lot of her characters, her stories really hit. It's just because we all can see ourselves in whatever she puts on pages. I was watching some other people's reviews on this specific book, and I will link them down below because I enjoyed them thoroughly. And then also I think I'm going to be referencing them a couple times in this video. Two people, coincidentally, brought up the same idea that because Sally Rooney is highly anticipated, because she has this large status, because we are waiting for the things that she comes out with, it almost makes it a little bit hard to kind of critically analyze her, because when you are the author that's highly anticipated, it almost makes it seem like, oh, now she's done it again for every single thing that she does, and it kind of takes away a little bit of like critical, I'd say like a little bit of like critical thought, because you're kind of just looking at how high of a status she has as opposed to like simply critiquing the content. What's that called? That's the cross you bear when you're that famous and that talented. But that is a point that I really appreciated, because I think that that is actually very common amongst book talk and booktube and bookstagram, is the idea that we go towards very trendy authors and we're like, oh, I really loved this part about this book, and we are repeating like the same exact things everybody's saying. But then when it comes to like unknown authors that we don't really know, I feel like it's easier to go in depth about the content. You know what I mean? Intermezzo follows two brothers. One's name is Ivan, one's name is Peter. They recently lost their father, and this book is kind of a showing the manifestation of their grief and how they deal with it. One thing that Sally Rooney does exceptionally well is really focus on the complexities of interpersonal relationships. So they're brothers, they have a very complicated relationship, very tense, but this also showcases their relationship to people they have romantic relationships with. So Ivan is the younger brother. He's 22. He turns 23 in this book, but he's 22 at the beginning of the book. He's a little bit awkward. He's very into chess. This book really hit me because my husband is very into chess. So in a lot of ways, I was like, is Ivan my husband? That's crazy. Versus his brother Peter is 10 years older than him, which is already kind of like a tense thing. Age gap relationships as it relates to family, oh, that can go one of a couple ways. You know what I mean? But Peter is very confident, arrogant, is a lawyer, looks down on Ivan in a lot of ways. Them losing their father really brought out the difficulties in their relationship, because you can also see the different relationships that they had to their father. Peter, the older one, did not get along with his father the way that Ivan did, and I kind of feel like it really also speaks to the idea of not everybody gets the same parent. Like, I feel like even with my siblings, I feel like we all got different versions of our parents, and that comes with resentment and sometimes anger. And so Peter holds on to a lot of that anger in this book. I was talking about the relationships and I completely got derailed by my own thoughts. But so Peter has been talking to, it actually starts off with him talking to this younger girl who's Ivan's age, so 10 years younger, named Naomi. And then he also has been talking to, for the last like couple years, his ex-girlfriend, his first love, Sylvia. That in itself is something I really grappled with in this book. Ivan is mother's older woman. Her name is Margaret. And so they start talking and get into a little bit of an age gap situationship, because Margaret is 36 and he is 22. So there's so many nuances and complications that are worked out through this book. There's a lot of shame that's carried. There's also a lot of connection. There's a lot of things, but I want to talk about the main themes that stood out to me in this book, which are grief. I wrote them down, so I have to look at my notes. Sorry. Grief, the complex nature and difficulties of having romantic and family relationships, and then what it says about our relationship to desiring validation. For Peter, he really, really, you can tell throughout this whole entire book, was really just wanting to cling on to love. And he found love through exercising his power and controlling situations for the most part. He was not a likable person, to me at least. I did not. But I also did see him as a valid person for looking for love in right and wrong places. And then there is Ivan, who is looking for validation just as a human being. He's just wanting to be seen for the good parts of him. He's very self deprecating and he's very open about it. I'd say he's very earnest in that way. He knows his flaws and he's very self aware of how awkward he is. And he really is kind of just dying for somebody to see the parts of him that are not just that, but he is also very just like outspoken about it at the same time. The themes of grief in this are very interesting. I specifically look for books that have themes of grief. The top things that I look for in books are introspection, grief, a socially explicit climate, something that's thrilling, and then a book that'll make me laugh as much as it'll make me cry. This book did not make me cry. It maybe made me giggle, but it was just more so very introspective and focused on grief, which I really do like. I do like to ponder on these things that she presents to us. It really hit for me because I feel like as somebody who's very tuned into grief, because I feel like I've had to grieve, I have a lot of ambiguous grief, basically. I like to read about it and kind of decipher it. This book is the themes of grief in this book were very interesting and very complicated because there are a lot of things that really were overt about Ivan and Peter's ways of coping with grief. From Peter's perspective, he was the one who gave the eulogy, even though he didn't have a close relationship with their father. So I feel like, in a way, he was trying to control his grief and his feelings towards his father by kind of giving the most perfect message to the people that knew him, even though he didn't have that deep of a he probably shouldn't have given the eulogy. It should have been Ivan. But like I mentioned, I feel like he's looking for love and control. And he's really grieving his father and grieving the fact that they had a complicated relationship. It's really unclear as to specifically what has happened between Peter and his dad. But to me, it kind of felt like maybe his dad just really didn't know how to be a dad, was maybe a little neglectful with Peter as they were growing up. And so once he died, Peter really just spun out. He's on a lot of drugs in the book. And somebody mentioned in a review, I think it's in one of the reviews down below, this book like reflects his kind of state of mind. It'll give you like very quick descriptions in the way that I'm if you are on something, that's the way that you're thinking. You're not thinking in grand, nuanced, ambiguous thoughts, you know? But I feel like his grief showed up in the fact that he has a lot of unresolved feelings with his father, and he didn't know how to deal with that. But also at the same time, when I think that when you're a kid of neglect, you do have this rage inside of you that really showed up in his feelings, in his actions. A lot of the things that he says to people, a lot of the relationships that he has are not handled well. And I really feel like that is because he was not really raised with the amount of love and compassion that he needed. So kind of turned into him being difficult and controlling, and kind of like at moments it was hard to read his perspective because he's not likable. It's really difficult sometimes to read. Then the way that grief manifests in Ivan is different because Ivan, I think, in a lot of ways, just wears his heart on his sleeve. He's a 22-year-old with braces, and he's trying to seduce this woman named Margaret, very openly awkward about everything, but also kind of immediately mentions what he's going through and how he's dealing with it, and is wanting to talk about his father. Peter doesn't really talk about things in depth the way that Ivan does, and I feel more for Ivan and the grief that he is going through just because he's more authentic about it, and it just feels a little bit more like he's genuinely processing it out loud, whereas Peter's processing it internally. um Grief is really difficult because it just manifests in us all incredibly differently. But yeah, that's really all I have to say about grief. I need to stop talking about that and go on to the next thing that I mentioned, which was the complex nature of difficult romantic and family relationships. This book, I really appreciated the fact that it was difficult dynamics. All of the dynamics are very tense and very stressed, and there's a lot of things that are not being said out loud. Like I mentioned, there's an age gap theme for both Peter and Ivan. Peter with somebody younger, Ivan with somebody older, and that in itself is a very taboo topic that I like that Sally Rooney has brought up, because I think that we do have a lot of thoughts on age gap relationships, and for the most part, I feel like our society has really just narrowed in on accepting that it's uncomfortable, and for the most part it feels exploitative. But in this book, I feel like there's a lot of nuances with the age gap relationships, because they openly talk about how their age gaps are not so black and white, and they have to work out the gray. Okay, so the difficulty in the relationship, the romantic relationship, is just that Peter is just going through this thing where he has his first love, who is age appropriate, who more so gets him, who I feel like he respects a hell of a lot more than the other love interest that he has, the younger girl, the girl who's more fun, the girl that he can do more things physically with, because the whole reason why his first love didn't work out is because she got into a large accident. It tainted their relationship and the things that they could do, like sexually. They can't really have a relationship there, so she cut things off, I can think, pretty much out of fear, but then he kind of was like, okay, fine, and then found this young girl named Naomi, and they're kind of in a relationship, but it's, for the most part, mostly just a sexual thing. But he interacts with Sylvia like as if they're, it's like a will they won't they type thing, but he also still has this thing with this other girl, and he also pays her from time to time, but it's, she's not a prostitute, it's a whole thing. And that whole dynamic, like, I feel like he really genuinely didn't love Naomi, because I think he really was just looking at that relationship, and he'll talk about this like as if I'm like as if I'm like talking shit about him, and he's like gonna like call me out on it, and I'd be like, well, he'll talk about this. So I don't think that he really loves Naomi. I think that it's a very transactional relationship, and I think that he thinks that he loves Naomi because he doesn't want to be lonely in their dynamic, and then I think that she thinks that she loves him because he gives her things. But I think he really wanted and loved Sylvia the whole time. And for the whole book, I just was thinking like, he needs to just break it off with Naomi and just be with Sylvia. And it was actually making me really mad whenever Sylvia would just accept the fact that her man was just, and I don't want to say her man like I'm rooting for them. I'm rooting for Sylvia's happiness more than I'm rooting for Peter. But it just made me kind of upset, because I just felt like, especially because he's 32, she's 22 or 23, I just couldn't see it as real. And then also the way that they spoke to each other, it was in a very joking way. But it wasn't real a lot of the time, the way that he would talk to Sylvia. So then the difficulty between Ivan and Margaret, they also have a age gap relationship, although um it's just more difficult because Ivan's the one who made the move on Margaret, and then Margaret was kind of like, ah, what the hell? She didn't say, ah, what the hell. She like kind of hesitantly said, oh, what the hell? But this is kind of inappropriate. I'm also going through like a separation with my husband, but I'll take whatever this is. Kind of finds herself into this with him, and they end up really liking each other. But it's very difficult because a large age gap, 36 and 22, and he still has braces on. I can't like, I'm 25. I don't want to be with somebody who's 20. That feels like that feels wild to me. It's not, but it also it just like feels like a different, I don't know. But for the most part, I feel like I see the good in their age gap relationship, because they're both being vulnerable, and they both are not transactional in the way that Peter is with Naomi. Okay, so then the last part that I have that I wanted to talk about was our relationship to desiring validation. Peter, this whole entire book, I really struggled with liking him. I really did, and I feel like a lot of people do probably, but I struggled with liking him because he was, and I want to be fair because I feel like a lot of people have been really fair on him when they have been reviewing this. A lot of, okay, if I were to be like very blunt and not fair, I would have just openly said, I didn't like him. He's very controlling and manipulative. He's in this inappropriate relationship with this young girl. He is constantly looking for vices that are not healthy at all. He is not good to his brother at all. He's really horrible and rude, and he needs to be told how to be a good person, which is disgusting. And Sylvia is really the only good thing about him because he is reminded how to be a good person when he's with her. That's if I were to give like no grace and I were to not be fair. However, because I do want to see these characters and I want to differentiate my feeling from this to be a fair reviewer. I do want to say that I think that Peter, like I mentioned earlier, was neglected. I think in a lot of ways there are things about his childhood that weren't like clearly laid out. Um, it's hard to think of the dad as maybe being neglectful because Ivan has laid out that his dad was like a great guy, that they were close, but I think that there's a lot there with Peter, and his coping skills are to turn to control and manipulation because he's yearning for any sort of love that he can get in destructive ways, unfortunately. So he seeks out control because he probably has some sort of, and also their mom is not that great too. I can imagine growing up with their mom. She seems very neglectful and very invalidating. I'm really trying to find a reason to see the humanness in Peter, but it's also difficult for me. Okay, so then as it relates to Ivan searching for any sort of validation, he was a lot more likable because I feel like a lot of us who have dealt with a lot of insecurities in relationships and then in relationship to ourselves, I feel like a lot of people probably see themselves more in Ivan than they do Peter. So that's why I feel more for Peter. And you can really just feel his need to be looked at as somebody who is a valid, kind human being who has talents. Like, in a lot of ways, he spent a lot of this book kind of downplaying the type of person that he is. I think that's because his inner voice and his brother have really downplayed the type of person that he is. So then that's kind of like his default, is to be like, I'm an awkward guy and I have braces and I'm not going to be Peter. So I feel bad about that. I'm going to be open and honest about the fact that I feel bad about that, but it's not going to stop me from pursuing the things that I want to pursue, which was like, great, you know? Ivan in my head, he's like, there's a specific actor that I'm thinking of that I thought of when I was reading, but if I were going to compare him to anybody outside of the actor who I was thinking of, who literally is perfect in my head, I don't know the name of, but if I were going to compare him to anybody, my second pick, if they like were to make a movie, would be Asa Butterfield, because he has that like forever young face, similar to myself, that I think would like really work well with Ivan. And Peter, if you ever watch Survivor, he reminds me of Vetus, and they have this whole like Vetus and Aris thing going on. That's a reference that if you do not watch Survivor, you don't know. But Vetus and Aris were essentially just like sibling rivals, and they had this whole thing where the younger brother was like the more successful, talented one, and the other brother was like a drug addict and really wanted to win Survivor just to like show up his brother but couldn't. Anyway, if you have any thoughts, I would appreciate you leaving them wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever time of day it is. I hope you have a valuable morning, afternoon, or night.